Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'm filming today a video that has been long requested, that I was sort of waiting to accumulate as much material as possible on, and kind of realised that there was no point like rushing through all of this stuff just to be able to tell you about it. So today's video is everything I know about cults. So this is a collaboration of all the things I've read, listened and watched about cults. I know cults is like a very popular special interest, I guess, or like phenomenon that people find fascinating for good reason. Like, it is a really perverse and macabre sort of facet of society that people find really inherently interesting, and particularly one of these books I recommend will hopefully provide some of those answers for you as to why we are all so fascinated with cults. So I know it's not like a particularly interesting I don't know, non-fiction genre to be interested in, as in lots of people are also interested in it. I do not claim to be the person who holds all of the information on all of the cults, and I'm not actually going to share much information on cults with you, more just the material that I've read that I find interesting. I thought it'd be fun to have it all in one video to direct you to, because I do get a lot of questions and DMs anytime I read a book about a cult. People are like, oh my god, do you have any more recommendations? So I thought I could put them all in here for you. So that being said, this video will differentiate between cults, high control groups, and like abuse of power within obscure religious groups. That is obviously different. There is a lot of grey area and controversy around the terms. I think high control group is like quite a common phrase used, and in no way am I suggesting these books that reference religious groups are all cults. In Amanda Montell's book that I'll talk about later, she talks specifically about like what makes a group high control and where that differs. A lot of these books and a lot of cults do have religious backgrounds to them, but that's not to suggest that all religion is a cult, and it's all about fanaticism and abuse of power, etc, etc. So I just thought I'd put that out there to ensure you guys don't think I'm making sweeping generalisations or broad strokes on organised religion, which I'm not. So there are 4 non-fiction books. I've read more than this. This is just the stuff that I think is worth you reading, if that makes sense. I'm not going to recommend like the shit stuff I've read, because there's a lot of shit, particularly there's a lot of poorly written fiction. So if anyone watching this writes books, please write some good literary fiction about cults. Like, it is ripe for novel material. I just don't know why there aren't enough books about it. Like, the ones I'm going to recommend I really enjoyed, some more than others, and then there's a few on my TBR, but like honestly searching for lists, like there is not a lot out there that doesn't swerve into like fantasy or magical realism. There's no like straight up realistic depictions, like character studies of people in cults. So anyway, that's my rant on that. The first one I'm going to start with is the one that's probably the most popular that most people have read, and that's The Girls by Emma Cline. I did really enjoy this. This is loosely based around the Manson cult. So it's like 60s and 70s LA. The cult is not named in the book. It's very obvious, I think, to most readers that the girls that we meet are the girls that followed the Manson family, that then partook later in the Tate murders, but it's not necessarily like accurate retelling. I did enjoy this book. It's probably, like I say, the most popular book you will read, fiction book in a cult setting. If you read literary fiction, it is worth your time, but it's not like, I think maybe because it holds that position as like one of the only good cult books, it maybe is like people get disappointed when they read it because they think it's like gonna be mind-blowing, and I wouldn't say it is. I like the writing. I then went on to read Emma Cline's short story collection, which I didn't really care for. So that is that one. And then a second, which is also quite popular and not necessarily always about cults, is Burnt Sugar by Avina Doshi, who was longlisted or shortlisted for the Booker. This book centres a mother-daughter relationship, and it's a lot about care and dementia, but there's a sideline story about a commune in India that is based off a real-life commune, and the author's extended family have connections to a high control group, the group that was actually featured in a documentary, Wild Wild Country, which I'll talk to you about later. So this is, I would say, like a cult adjacent book. Like it has inklings of the experiences that the mother has, the dress codes, the life of the commune, the like ideas of socialism that went on there, but it's not necessarily like a full-blown cult novel, I would say. And then a book that I hear less people talk about, I'm just trying to get the author's name up for you, but I absolutely love, is The Rapture by Claire McGlasson. I read this maybe 4 years ago, so my memory is a little hazy on it, but it is about a high control religious group called the Panacea Society. I think it's set in the, I want to say like the early 20th century, and it's described as a terribly English cult. So it follows a main character, Dilys, who joins this all-women's Panacea Society that is based off Christianity, and it's a story of her experience moving into the house. It's a very small town, and her experiences, with joining the religion, the indoctrination, the experiences, the way that they twist religious texts to become doctrine. It's very atmospheric of the time, I felt like, and it was very interesting. There's a little bit of like sapphic romance maybe in there, story of friendship, of course abuse of power, and I think the exploration of religion in this was actually really well done, and it's not a book I see often read. I feel like Simon read it and liked it, I'm not sure, but I really recommend it. Actually, I had a really good time reading it when I did, and I am obsessed with this cover. Like, I think it's so cool. Okay, and finally, the other cult-ish, cult-adjacent book, literary fiction book that I loved was Woman Talking by Miriam Toews. So this, again, is not necessarily a full-blown cult. This is based off a commune group of like Orthodox Mennonite women, and it looks a lot at the experiences of religion. It follows the aftermath of a series of rapes and sexual assaults, violent attacks on the women in this group, and the men in the story are trying to suggest to the women that it's an act of God, that they are being abused by powers that be, sort of thing, like non-human entities, when in fact it is the men in the group who are abusing these women, and we witness them talking in this barn late at night, plotting whether they should leave or stay in the group, and what they will do if they leave. They have little access to the outside world, they have little knowledge of geography, of time and space, they don't really know how to go about leaving this rural area that they are living in. They have access to a commune that lives next door, but they don't have access to maps. There's a really interesting conversation there about isolation, and a lot on gender, a lot on violence, and it's definitely like a high control situation. And I believe Miriam Toews grew up Mennonite, I think, because a lot of her work does focus on it, but this is like definitely not a book for everyone in terms of writing style, because it's very dense, because it's on the page conversations with all of these women. You don't really leave the time and space, this one night that it's set over, although you visit other memories and places within the story. The entire book is a conversation, which I know won't be for everyone, but I thought this book was brilliant, and I have been meaning to read more Miriam Toews ever since, so that is a reminder for me. And there's a few I have on my TBR. I know there's a lot more that I could read, but I've just heard like reviews that I know I wouldn't enjoy them. I know the River Solomon's book, Grace read earlier in the year and didn't like the twist that it took in terms of like sci-fi-esque feature, so I know that won't be for me. And there's been a couple of others that have got like pretty mediocre reviews that fall more on the juvenile YA category that I won't be picking up, but these are the ones I am interested in. So the first one I think is probably the one I hear the most about, and that's The Likeness by Emily Temple. So this is about it's a young protagonist. She runs away from home and retraces her path back to the Levitation Center. She enrolls in a summer program for troubled teens known as Buddhist Boot Camp for Bad Girls. So it's a story of a group of young girls or women deciding to learn to levitate, but within that is wrapped up this idea of like enlightenment and access to higher power. So it says it's a desire and danger intertwine, and Olivia comes close to discovering what a body and a girl is capable of. The Course of a Fateful Summer, it looks at fairy tales, cognitive science, and religious fervour. The obsession with youth and the passion to continue the concepts as complex as faith and loving people. So yeah, I think this is like cult adjacent, more high control group situation. Was published a couple of years ago. Says it has some sapphic rep, which is interesting. And it's got a 3.4 on Goodreads, which isn't great, but tell me if you've read this one. Is it worth me picking up? The next one I have not heard mentioned, and the only reason I put off reading this is because I've read so much content around this specific cult, and that is Jim Jones and the People's Temple. So The Children of Paradise is a retelling of, loosely based on the incidents that occurred, or the massacre that occurred in Guyana. So if you know the story of Jim Jones, he began as a preacher, ended up as a cult leader, and then moved his entire American cult followers to a remote part of Guyana where they were building like paradise. So this says it is an imagined novel based on the true events of the utopian commune in Guyana. It's written by a playwright and a poet, which does intrigue me. So it follows Joyce and her young daughter as they follow their leader to Guyana from California with 1,000 other of God's chosen people. It's told with sweeping perspective and lush prose shimmering with magic and devastating with clarity. An exploration of oppression, the body and the mind. So I believe it's told interspersed like the mother and the daughter perspective. And one of them escapes and then is retelling the story. So that does sound like my kind of thing. Again, it's got a 3.3 on Goodreads. Like, is that actually going to be good? I'm not sure. But if you haven't read a lot about Jim Jones, I feel like you might find that more exciting if you haven't read a lot of non-fiction about Jim Jones, because I like know the story inside out. I feel like there's not much more I can consume about it, so maybe there. And then another one, which again is more high control group, which came out this year, which was it longlisted? I thought it was going to be if it wasn't, and that's Revival Season by Monica West. So this is the daughter of one of the Southern's most famous Baptist preacher, discovers a secret about her father which puts her at odds with her faith. So if you know the story of Jim Jones, he started out as a preacher, and there's a lot of stories about his young life. So this says they travel as a family through small southern towns for revival season, holding these mass healing services, which I've watched and read a lot about, sort of crisis actors and religious healing. So it says that this summer the revival season doesn't go to plan as the healing powers never work, and then Miriam witnesses an act of violence which shakes her faith. So she discovers that she might have the power to heal, even though her father and her church have made it clear that these powers will be denied to women. Over the course of the next year, she decides between faith and family. So it says it's a look at feminism, spiritual awakening, and disillusionment in the evangelical community. Again, not suggesting Christianity is a cult. But I think it's interesting from the coming of age child protagonist perspective, and I think the idea of the preaching circle is really interesting, and yeah, definitely one I will be seeking out some more reviews of. Okay, let's move to non-fiction, which is obviously where cult content comes into its own. So I've read a lot of books about cults that are retellings or like historical biographies. My two favourite, which are like chunky books, I recommend them on audio. I did read both of these, I think, as hard copies, which is kind of unheard of for me because I think they're like over 500 pages each. And they are written by Jeff Gunn. So he is a historian, biographer, and focuses on cults or notorious figures. So there's The Road to Jonestown, Jim Jones, and The People's Temple, which is like he writes straight up biographical non-fiction, like chronologically, following the lives of these individuals. So it like starts with Jim Jones's young life, the trauma, the experiences he had as a child, moving away, starting out The People's Temple, believing in socialism, his connection to California, and some really interesting observations on his the idea of like goodness and how he preached socialism and belief in access to services for everyone, and then obviously moving his group to Guyana and then murdering them all in a mass suicide attempt. So that is if you want like a play-by-play of Jim Jones's life, I would recommend that one. And then second to that is The Manson Life and Times, Manson, The Life and Times of Charles Manson. So that is the Manson family, of the Tate murders, of the girls book, of what's the Quentin Tarantino film that came out? Same murder in that. So that again follows his young life. He was like very troubled. I'm not sure if Jim Gunn described him as a sociopath, but potentially. Or his move to LA, that talks a lot about the like free love movement, Hate Street, San Francisco, and then setting up his commune in California, believing in the end of the days, and again, like his involvement with the police, and then going on to murder people, etc., etc. So I loved both of those. They're like proper hardcore if you really want to know the ins and outs. They're the ones for you. And then there is Cultish, which I've talked about loads on this channel before, so I won't rave about it again, but this is not necessarily about an individual cult. This is on the language of cults, talking about, particularly in the current neoliberal context, how we can define certain movements, whether that's Soul Cycle or Glossier Girls or whatever it is, as cults, because they are, they breed this identity first, sort of following that people give away part of themselves to join. It talks about multi-level marketing schemes, but the first good chunk of the book is actually referencing like historic cults like Jim Jones, Heaven's Gate, those kind of like groups that you would have heard about before, but giving, I think particularly in the Jim Jones insight, it was like the first time I'd read something new or interesting about Jim Jones after like consuming what I thought was the whole story. So there's some excerpts from survivors of the massacre. I think there was like maybe 7 people that survived, so that one is really interesting, and one I recommend if you like feel like you know a lot about like cults, but if you want to learn about a new take, I guess, then I think that one is really good. Alongside that is Cult Following, which is a book I read recently and also did in a wrap-up. So the byline is My Escape and Return to the Children of God. This is Bexy Cameron's autobiography slash, what do you call it? Memoir of her experiences growing up in the British sect, or partly the British sect of the Children of God, but also lived in different continents around the world. Children of God are like a very controversial, huge group. You will know them because Joaquin Phoenix, Rose McGowan, a couple of other big celebrities grew up in Children of God families, so you can read lots of it from their perspective, although I do not recommend Rose McGowan's memoir. I really didn't like that at all. I actually DNF'd it halfway through, but on Betsy Cameron's take on it is really interesting. So she is a documentary filmmaker by profession, and she's going out, part of the book is her going out to meet other high control groups now, like in current time, while also reflecting on her experiences in Children of God, how that made her the person she is now, and also like a rebuilding of her relationship with her family, and some really intense interviews and conversations with her parents, asking them like why they let Children of God take over their lives. I find Children of God probably one of the most disturbing cults, I think, because of its like reputation and attachment to paedophilia and grooming, and just like the child abuse in it is just like absolutely horrific to read about. I mean, most of these cults are obviously horrific, but I think Children of God was so widespread and like actually had so many people in it at its height that I just found it really terrifying. So that is Betsy Cameron's book. So I'm looking down because my iPad is here. I'm just going to bring it here. And then, of course, a couple that you will probably know and have already read, similar to the girls, is Educated by Tara Westover, which is a book I read a long time ago but did really enjoy at the time. I know it gets some criticism now about its accuracy, which I think there's another conversation to be had there about believing particularly young women's stories, and that's a potentially like quite a neoliberal take on escaping an end of day like religious group cult, because it's all about the power of education. Potentially I think her story has been marketized in some respects to appeal to an audience, give us that feel good flavour of like what we can do if we all just educate and encourage children to learn, which is slightly frustrating, but nonetheless one I think a lot of people will have read. And then the second of that similar ilk is Unfollow by Megan Phelps Roper of the Westboro Baptist Church. So if you've watched any of Louis Theroux's documentaries on his time in America and travelling to meet different groups, some cults, some religious groups, some just heinous groups of people, you will know the Westboro Baptist Church as the most hated family in America. So her memoir is about, it's really interesting. I don't think it's, for me it was like lacking a lot in certain respects. I think I reviewed it like when I read it on this channel like 20 vlogs ago or something, but for the context of this video, it is an interesting read because it talks a lot about the social media and how she found her way out of the group, and like that she was so deeply indoctrinated in from birth through Twitter basically, and like conversations with other people. So I think it's quite interesting about partisan and like conversations with people who don't agree with you. So that is one I'm sure you might have already read if you are a Louis Theroux fan or not. Okay, one of my favourite memoirs on cults that I don't see reviewed very often is In the Days of Rain, and the byline is A Daughter, a Father, a Cult. It's by Rebecca Stott. I read this when I first moved to Brighton because it's actually set there. It's about the Exclusive Brethren, which was like a religious group cult that believed the world was ruled by Satan. They were very much like end of days, closed community. Women, it was like patriarchal, women were subservient to men, women didn't speak, there was no roles in the group for women. So Roger is the dad, and the book is written by the daughter, like reflecting on her experiences, and it's so like quite harrowing to read because it opens on this like remote house where the father is dying basically of alcoholism, and she's gone out to visit him, sort of like has nothing left, and talks about how sort of like the cult ruined his life. But he was a high-ranking Brethren minister, but was like deeply invested in the arts, like would break the rules that he preached to his family, would have copies of like Shakespeare and poetry that he like hid in his car, and he ended up they ended up taking their family out of the cult for after like an incident, I think it was of sexual assault, and the dad broke away and then ended up with a gambling addiction, in prison for some time. And we reflect on sort of like his dad, the dad dying, while Rebecca reflects to him on their experiences growing up and how insular her childhood was. And when we open with Roger and Rebecca at this house where her father has cancer, he hands over part of his own writing on what they refer to as like the Nazi decade, which was like a period in the 1960s where the Brethren were carrying out some really coercive, abusive practices that were trying to like split apart families to really like cement the cult like, you know, high control situation. And he has writings on those and he shares them with Rebecca. So like it's super emotive to read. It's like it's very beautifully written. Like Rebecca is a brilliant writer, and I feel like often with memoir, you're reading more for like the narrative and less for the writing, but I feel like in this one it's like such a good combination of the both. And yeah, just so interesting to read about this tiny group of people in like a city that I was living in that I had no knowledge of. But yeah, really interesting on the Exclusive Brethren, if you don't know those. Then I read a couple of books on Irvin LeBaron and his polygamous Mormon cult. So I read The Polygamous Daughter by Anna LeBaron, which is probably the most popular. You'll recognise this cover. I'm already dreading the editing of how many covers I'm going to have to put up for this. So this is about a Mormon cult between like southern USA and Mexico. It's really interesting because it's about this like radical offshoot of Mormonism that is not practiced now, and involves the FBI and multiple cases of child abuse and poverty and destitution. So it says that her father was wanted by the FBI for killing the people who tried to leave his cult, and her and her sisters were always on the run with the other sister wives, often starving, always desperate, and the children lived in terror. There were dozens of them. And then it tells the story of her escape when she was 13, and then on from that is like the people who helped her escape, and then the loss of life that came after that from people who were no longer able to reconcile like their own history with the cult, which is like absolutely harrowing to read about, and just also the lack of support that people who survive these things get. And then following on from that, which is also of the LeBaron group, but is The Sound of Gravel by Ruth Warner. And this is really interesting because it's from another family who were in the same commune's perspective. So they lived like more full-time in rural Mexico, so it's like a sister wife of the other book, if that makes sense, like the family. So it says Ruth Warner was the 39th of her father's 42 children. She grew up in rural Mexico. Her family were casted back between Mexico and the United States in order to collect like government assistance because they were obviously destitute. There's this really harrowing perspective, but Ruth actually also escapes 2 years after Anna, and they reconnect after writing these books, which is really amazing. And this story is much more deeply entrenched from like that really innocent childhood perspective of like, it doesn't really plot out play by play all of the like macro issues that went on in the commune in terms of like the FBI and the people searching for the missing people, or like the manhunts and stuff. It was like very much just her experience of growing up without any stable like family or parentage. It's really harrowing to read, and particularly like the scenes that bring the title into play. There's a lot, big trigger warning for ableism, because there's a lot of content about her disabled sibling and the way that they were treated, and just a number of actually harrowing childhood deaths that occur through negligence. But yeah, one I really recommend. I think I preferred The Sound of Gravel to The Polygamous Daughter, but they actually work quite well if you read them not together, but like with some time apart, to compare the perspectives of people in the same group. Okay, and finally, in the ones that I've read that I can tell you about is this is probably like the most recent cult or high control group, which is like really interesting, the concept of this. This is NXIVM. The book is Scarred, The True Story of How I Escaped NXIVM, The Cult That Bound My Life, by Sarah Edmonton. So NXIVM's a really interesting one because it's based off of like a multi-level marketing scheme that is grounded in this idea of like self-help and self-promotion, or like higher self, like it's a very wellness based cult. So it's really interesting group to read about. The trial is going on right now, and you probably will have heard the name Keith Raniere around. So also Alison Mack and a couple of other huge celebrities in the US were involved in the group. But I think it's really interesting to compare this cult story to ones that happened earlier, like at the end of the 20th century, because this is so like capitalistic and neoliberal. It's kind of crazy. So this follows the story of Sarah Edmonton, and she wrote this book off the back of a podcast that she did with a journalist friend, which is brilliant, which I'll highlight in a second for you. But NXIVM, like I said, is like a high control self-help group, and the part that she ended up joining was this subsection called DOS, which was like a sisterhood sort of like faux feminism angle of the group that they thought was run by one of the women in the group, but actually was headed by the same cult leader as the rest of it. And it's about branding and the idea of like secrets and blackmail, and oh my god, it's horrible. But a super recent one to read about. So the trial is like ongoing right now with Keith Raniere, which is kind of crazy, and I love to follow. And the last book I read about cults, non-fiction, is The Family by Chris Johnson and Rosie Jones. I read this years ago. So this is a piece of investigative journalism about Anne Hamilton Brine. So this is the family in Australia, not to be confused with the Manson family. This is an Australian cult which honestly has some of the most terrifying imagery of children I've ever seen in my life. You can see through the cover these like black and white people that they the leader, the mum and dad of the group, like dyed all the children's hair blonde. Like it's a crazy story. So she believed that she was Jesus Christ, and it's about like an end of days apocalyptic group in Australia, but they lived in like a rural suburb, but ended up recruiting like politicians, businessmen, like loads of people to donate money to this group. And she stole children, fed them LSD. It's a crazy story. And was really into like ritualistic, like old Christian beliefs, kind of. So it's set in, I think it started in the 60s and it ends in like a huge FBI raid in like the late 80s. But yeah, interesting to read about it. Set in Australia, because often you read cults that are like mostly USA, to be honest, except the Children of God's obviously worldwide, and then I've read a couple in the UK. But yes, one that I thought was brilliant and worth a read if you're like super interested in one particular group. This again is like a play-by-play story. And there's a couple of others on the Keith Raniere cult, NXIVM, that I haven't read yet. A couple of them I don't think I'm going to read because I feel like there's not enough new information about the story for me to enjoy. Enjoy is the wrong word, but you know what I mean? Like me to consume a whole book on, when I think often sometimes the books tend to be talking about the same stuff over and over again because they only know a small amount of information about them. And that's why I liked the Scarred of the NXIVM cult, because it's from someone who was in it, so obviously you're going to have the most information that way. But there's one out that came out earlier this year by Sarah Berman, and it's called Don't Call It a Cult, The Shocking Story of Keith Raniere and the Women of NXIVM. So that delves into the different NXIVM figures and is specifically about like the DOS movement and the women that were in some cases trafficked, and also like led to believe that this group would seek creative coaching and networking opportunities but found themselves enslaved and branded. So if you haven't read about that one, then that option sounds good. And there's a second one called The Program, which I'm more interested in reading. So Inside the Mind of Keith Raniere, The Rise and Fall of NXIVM. So this is more from his perspective. It's similar. I didn't watch The Vow, but I know The Vow is like an HBO series that is a true drama of similar arguments. So the Hollywood sex cult, this chronicles the rise of the enigmatic cult leader from its patient zero, his former girlfriend and test subject for the coercive control technique. So I think this one will be interesting because it's like from his start to end, and it looks at particularly, it's written by his ex-girlfriend and the story of like how she was abused in their relationship and how she like can extrapolate that into the way that he became a cult leader. So that is one that's definitely on my radar to listen to. You'll notice that there is no Scientology books here for me to reference, and I'll tell you what, that's because I find Scientology fucking boring. Like, I think it's quite a boring cult in terms of like the systems that they use. Obviously I watched like the Louis Theroux, and I've like attempted to read 2 or 3 of the Scientology memoirs, and all of them are so boring. I could not get through any of them. I think just like because a lot of the way they talk, like a lot of them are very about the minute detail of the way that everyday practices work, and their like main practice is all about, I can't remember what it's called, but it's like it's a lot about language and words and like retraining your brain, and so going through those conversations over and over again is not that interesting to me. I want to read the Leah, what's her name? I'll put the picture up here, but the audiobook went missing for a while. I believe it's back now, so I might try and listen to that one. But I know obviously Scientology shuts down a lot of content that people make about it. So I think we need to wait for some kind of big court action before we'll get the good books on that. But if you do or have read a Scientology book you really liked, then please let me know, because I'll tell you if it's one I've tried. Excuse the outfit and hair change, I just washed my hair, but this is editing me coming back to say I'm splitting this video into 2 parts because it was inaudibly long for you to watch in one go, and I didn't want anyone to drop off in the middle and miss out on extra recommendations. So this is the end of part 1. In part 2 next week you will see TV, podcasts, documentaries, and all the non-fiction cult books that are on my TBR that I haven't read yet. So hope you enjoyed this section. Give this video a thumbs up, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye!